It begins quietly, not with fire or blood, but with a quiet assumption that what has always been will always be. At the height of its power, an empire rarely notices the tremor beneath its feet. It stands tall, armed, wealthy, radiant under the illusion of permanence. But the pattern begins here, in the stillness before the shift. There is a rhythm to collapse, a sequence not written in books, but in the choices made by those who believe they are immune to gravity. Time and again, civilizations have risen under banners of conquest and commerce, only to fall by the same hand that raised them. The pattern is not one of fate, but of repetition. Spain, Britain, the Soviet Union, names etched into the stone of power, now softened by erosion. They shared no borders. They spoke no common tongue. Yet they moved in unison through the same 7 stages, unaware they were dancing to a music they could not hear. The pattern begins when a nation, flush with victory, begins to believe its reach knows no bounds. Its armies multiply. Its borders stretch. Commitments are made across oceans, in deserts, through mountains. Security becomes projection. Projection becomes overreach. Spain's silver fleets, Britain's global colonies, the USSR's ideological satellites, each believed expansion was strength. But every new frontier demanded more men, more ships, more gold. The balance tipped. What began as dominance became weight. And yet, no empire senses the danger when the coin still bears its seal. When its currency is the language of trade, when its flag draws both awe and fear. Power deceives. It conceals the cost of its own ambition. When cracks first form, they are invisible to those who stand at the top. The economy still hums, the military still marches, the currency still holds. But beneath the marble, the foundation groans. What follows is not an explosion, but a slow exhale, a quiet choice repeated often. To borrow instead of earn, to print instead of save, to defend everywhere rather than rebuild anywhere. In time, the empire that once produced begins to consume. Its factories dim, its fields go fallow. It imports what it once exported: goods, ideas, even hope. Spain hoarded silver and forgot how to grow grain. Britain built machines but lost the will to maintain them. The Soviet Union mined loyalty but couldn't feed its people. It always begins the same way, the illusion of limitless wealth feeding a hollow core. When the heart of a nation stops producing and starts depending, decline is no longer a possibility. It is a promise. And still, they believed. Belief is the last thing to break. Each told itself the same story, that they were different, that history bent around them, that exceptions could be made just this once. But history keeps no favorites. It erases empires with the same indifference it grants them rise. Now the same script plays again, a nation with bases in every corner of the world, a currency no longer tethered to substance, a mountain of debt built higher with each sunrise. It calls itself exceptional, but the pattern is blind to names. It sees only actions, and the sequence has already begun. This is not prophecy. It is memory repeating. A cycle observed too many times to ignore. The beginning is never marked by the fall of a city or the firing of a shot. It begins with confidence, with certainty, with the belief that decline is something that happens to others. But decline, once started, is a quiet tide. It does not retreat. Long before the collapse, there is the ascent, a rise so steep and bright it blinds those who live within it. The story always starts with discovery, of land, of wealth, of an idea powerful enough to ignite ambition. From that spark, a structure emerges: markets, fleets, armies, and laws. Systems are built to organize the chaos, to extract order from opportunity. The empire is born not in conquest, but in belief. That growth can be endless. That power, once attained, can be preserved. In its earliest form, the empire is lean, resourceful, agile. Its people work, build, trade. They invent tools and systems. They risk and they reap. Productivity is not yet tainted by arrogance. The reward feels earned, and for a time it is. Cities rise, roads stretch outward, coins bear the seal of trust. The early stage is marked not by excess but by momentum. Spain had its mines, Britain had its machines, the Soviet Union had its vision, and each believed they had found the formula for permanence. But the seeds of decline are planted in the soil of expansion. With growth comes expectation. With expectation comes promise. And soon the engine that once generated wealth begins to require it. Governments, now flush with power, grow bold. They extend their reach not because they must, but because they can. Defense becomes doctrine. Presence becomes pressure. To pull back would be to lose face. And so they do not pull back. They step further out. But every step outward draws resources from the core. Each promise made abroad must be funded at home. Taxes rise, debts mount. And when that is not enough, the illusion begins. Money created from nothing. Currency untethered from value. A quiet theft spread across generations. This shift is rarely noticed by those it affects. People continue their lives. The currency still buys bread. The soldiers still wear uniforms. But the meaning behind the symbols begins to decay. Money that once reflected effort now reflects only decree. Trust persists, but it grows fragile. The empire becomes accustomed to easy wealth. Imports rise. Manufacturing fades. Innovation slows. The people who once built the foundation begin to leave, or worse, to stop caring. Talent flows outward. Ambition shifts to other shores. What remains is not the engine of growth, but the machinery of consumption. And yet the outer image still gleams. There are ceremonies, parades, speeches of strength. The illusion is maintained with discipline. Numbers are adjusted. Failures are reframed. The press repeats the script. The people, busy and distracted, absorb the message that all is well, that the empire remains strong. But the weight grows, like a ship adding cargo faster than it can sail. The hull groans, the winds shift, and far in the distance a storm begins to gather. The leaders of the empire, those tasked with steering, face a choice: to correct the course or to accelerate, and almost always they choose speed. Because to slow down would be to admit what they already fear, that the trajectory is unsustainable. Here, in this middle space between rise and decline, the empire feels most confident. It still commands, still dazzles, still expands. But beneath the surface, the engine is breaking down, not all at once, but piece by piece. The gears grind louder, the fuel runs thinner, and still it presses on. This is not yet collapse. It is the height of motion before the fall, the light before the flicker, the moment when a nation mistakes momentum for immortality. It is the most dangerous moment of all. Within every empire lies a machine, not of steel or gears, but of policy, habit, and belief. It turns without pause, converting promises into structures, structures into systems, and systems into doctrine. At first, it is adaptive. It listens. It learns. But over time, the machine grows rigid. It forgets its origin and clings only to its own momentum. This is where the inner mechanics begin to reveal themselves. The empire, now vast and aging, is powered not by ingenuity, but by maintenance. It costs more to hold than to build, more to defend than to create. The military, once lean and decisive, swells into bureaucracy. Bases multiply, missions blur. The empire promises safety, but cannot define its threats. Resources shift from enterprise to enforcement, from growth to surveillance. The tax burden rises. Borrowing becomes policy, And each new crisis, foreign or domestic, is met with more spending, more legislation, more force. The empire becomes its own justification. Behind the facade, the numbers begin to unravel. Growth slows, but expectations remain. Budgets rise while productivity stalls. The gap is filled with illusions: paper money, abstract wealth, inflated assets. Officials speak of strength, but trade deficits grow. Imports surge, infrastructure decays. The empire consumes more than it produces and calls it progress. Currency, once anchored in value, drifts into abstraction. No longer backed by gold or labor, it floats on trust alone. Trust in the government, trust in the markets, trust in a system that quietly rewrites the meaning of value. When printing replaces earning, when speculation replaces production, the machine begins to falter. Still, the performance continues. Leaders pledge renewal. Experts offer reassurances. Indicators are cherry-picked. Doubts are dismissed. The media speaks in rhythms that soothe. The stock market rises. The people adjust. They adapt to rising prices, shrinking wages, fewer options. They believe because the alternative is unthinkable. But cracks form in the foundation. Small at first. A factory closes, a port idles, a generation graduates with nowhere to go. The young feel it first, the weight of debt, the scarcity of purpose, the hollowness behind ambition. Then the middle, the entrepreneurs, the builders, find fewer paths, more obstacles. Innovation slows. Risk is punished. Compliance rewarded. And beneath it all, a quiet fatigue spreads. Not just economic, but cultural. The shared story, the myth that once united people across regions and classes, begins to fracture. Identity fragments. Dialogue breaks down. Institutions once revered become suspect. Faith in the system thins. The empire responds not with reform, but with ritual. More spending, more laws, more spectacle, but less effect. Like a body that reacts to illness with fever and inflammation, the empire defends itself by growing more centralized, more controlling, more desperate. At this stage, enemies grow bold, allies grow distant. The empire, once the anchor of global stability, becomes the risk others must hedge against. Trade routes shift. Treaties are questioned. Alternatives emerge. The world begins to prepare for what the empire refuses to imagine. The machine, once admired, now groans beneath its own weight. It no longer serves. It survives. It functions, but it does not progress. And still it spins, grinding forward on the remnants of momentum, dragging with it the belief that tomorrow will resemble yesterday. But the system is no longer self-sustaining. It is devouring itself. Slowly, invisibly, inevitably, and no one knows how to stop it. Not because the solutions are unknown, but because they are unacceptable to those who benefit most from its current design. In the high tide of success, vulnerability hides in plain sight. Expansion feels like strength, growth like destiny. The empire, now fully matured, mistakes scale for security. But what appears as triumph is often the onset of imbalance, so gradual, so quiet, that even those within cannot feel the shift. Momentum sustains the illusion. The currency circulates. The markets respond. The military remains deployed. But the core is brittle. A system built on leverage cannot withstand friction. Each promise made, pensions, subsidies, entitlements, guarantees, becomes a liability. Each policy layered atop the last, until flexibility disappears. Debt, once a tool of growth, becomes a necessity. New borrowing pays old interest. Budgets are no longer crafted, they are inherited. The future is mortgaged, year after year, to preserve the illusion of stability. The empire speaks of strength, but fears correction. It cannot pause, because pausing would reveal how far it's drifted. Abroad, the map is littered with commitments: defense treaties, aid packages, forward bases, each one a node in a network of global presence. But presence becomes pressure. The cost to maintain each promise exceeds the value it returns. The empire stretches further, chasing influence, preserving image, while at home, decay accelerates. Infrastructure frays. Cities crumble. Institutions stall. The empire invests more in surveillance than in schools, more in weapons than in water. And as the system begins to strain, it turns inward, not to reform, but to control. Regulation tightens. Dissent is labeled disloyalty. Fear becomes a political instrument. Still, the narrative holds. The empire cannot fail, it tells itself, because it never has. Past crises were overcome. The system always finds a way. But history is not a guarantee, it is a warning, and the signs multiply. The middle class, once the engine of stability, begins to evaporate. Wages stagnate. Housing becomes a luxury. Healthcare a privilege. Education a debt trap. Families adjust their expectations downward. Children inherit less than their parents. Hope contracts. The culture fragments. What was once shared identity turns tribal. Ideology replaces dialogue. Every disagreement becomes existential. The center does not hold because the center no longer exists, and in its absence, extremes thrive. The elite retreat into gated enclaves, physical and digital, their wealth insulated from consequence, their power untouched by vote or voice. They speak of unity but act in isolation. The gap between governed and governing widens until the two barely recognize each other. Meanwhile, the external world adapts. Rivals build alternatives. Competitors innovate. Allies drift. The empire's influence no longer inspires. It imposes. Its prestige no longer earned. It is demanded. And the more it insists on obedience, the more resistance it breeds. Trade slows. Agreements unravel. Currency begins to lose its luster, not in collapse, but in preference. Partners quietly diversify. Transactions move to other systems, other denominations. The shift is tectonic, silent, powerful, irreversible. And through it all, the empire accelerates. Speed becomes its only strategy. More stimulus, more projection, more control. Like a machine out of calibration, it vibrates harder to maintain the illusion of function. This is the stage where collapse becomes possible. Not certain, but within reach. A sudden spark, economic, geopolitical, or social, could ignite the imbalance. And once it begins, the unraveling is swift. But in this moment, there is no spark, only the pressure, only the weight, only the silence before something breaks. It begins subtly, like the first breath of cold air after a long summer, barely noticed but undeniable. The system, once humming beneath the surface of everyday life, now sputters, not in spectacular failure, but in ordinary things that no longer work. Trains that don't arrive, shelves left empty, services delayed, expectations lowered. The signs of strain, long ignored, become daily reality. Institutions lose their authority, not by force but by erosion. Trust fades, replaced by suspicion. Courts, schools, legislatures, once pillars, stand but no longer support. Their words carry less weight. Their reach grows shorter, and still the system insists it is fine. Social decay is not chaos. It is entropy, a quiet unraveling of cohesion. Where once there was shared purpose, now there is fragmentation. People speak past one another, not through malice, but through the absence of common ground. The language still sounds the same, but it no longer means the same thing. Crime no longer shocks. Homelessness blends into the cityscape. The desperate are no longer unseen. They are simply unacknowledged. Opioids, once a crisis, are now a background noise, Addiction becomes ordinary. Despair becomes routine. And in this normalcy, empathy recedes. The educated flee, not from bombs or bullets, but from bureaucracy, from paralysis. They leave in mind or body, withdrawing from systems they no longer believe in. Talent disperses. What remains is either captured by ideology or consumed by survival. Fertility falls. Fewer children are born into a system seen as unstable. The future shrinks. A society that once expanded by sheer demographic force now contracts, quietly, year by year. Schools close, neighborhoods empty. The culture begins to age in place. Politically, dysfunction hardens. Gridlock is no longer a bug. It is the operating model. Each side sees the other not as misguided, but illegitimate. No victory is accepted, no loss conceded. Governance becomes performance, not policy. The state becomes spectacle. In response, the public retreats. Some into nostalgia, others into conspiracy, still others into numb acceptance. Hope is privatized. Belief in the collective fades. Community is replaced by consumption. Loyalty is to brand, not neighbor. And yet, the machine keeps turning, not because it works, but because no one knows how to stop it. Budgets are passed, press releases written, promises made, but fewer believe, and fewer still act. The center cannot command, and the margins no longer listen. This is the moment when the empire becomes hollow, not gone, not yet collapsed, but empty. A shell of its former self, maintaining structure without substance. The rituals continue. Elections, ceremonies, holidays, but the meaning drains from each. Abroad, the empire is watched. Its allies grow anxious. Its rivals grow bold. They test boundaries, probe weaknesses, not with full assault, but with careful calibration. And the empire, distracted by its own fragmentation, hesitates. It is not defeated, it is disoriented, weakened not by invasion, but by internal contradiction. The myths no longer align with the reality. The model no longer fits the moment. And still it clings to the script, the same declarations, the same assumptions, as if repetition can reverse entropy, as if certainty can conjure strength. But the tide has turned, not in drama, but in direction. The path forward is no longer upward. It is downward, inward, slower. The empire remains standing, but it is no longer growing, no longer believing. It is remembering, doubting, drifting. And somewhere in the distance, a new world is beginning to form, beyond its reach, beyond its rules, beyond its story. There is a moment in every decline when the scale tilts too far to be recovered. Not with a crash, but with a whisper. The realization that what held the system together is no longer holding. Confidence, once assumed, begins to slip away. It doesn't vanish all at once. It leaks through headlines, through decisions, through the quiet shift in what people choose to believe. The world watches differently now. Investors, once eager to hold the empire's debt, begin to hesitate. Allies reconsider alliances. Rivals sense hesitation, and in that hesitation they act. The empire's currency, once the unquestioned medium of exchange, becomes a question itself. Slowly, at first. Transactions shift, reserves diversify, central banks hedge, not because collapse has happened, but because trust is no longer absolute. The dollar, or its equivalent, was once more than money. It was faith in the system that issued it. But faith is fragile. It rests on expectation, and expectation rests on performance. When performance declines, faith wavers. When promises falter, alternatives emerge. Nations that once anchored their economies to the empire's stability begin to explore new alignments. Trade routes reroute. Energy deals are signed in other denominations. Agreements once assumed permanent are quietly rewritten. The empire, accustomed to setting terms, now negotiates from memory. At home, the shift feels abstract. The money still works. The lights stay on. But beneath that surface, the dam begins to crack. The influx of returning currency, no longer needed abroad, creates a new problem. Inflation, asset bubbles, imbalance. The system floods with liquidity it cannot absorb. What was once global demand becomes domestic surplus. The cost of everything rises. The value of trust declines. The government responds in the only way it knows: stimulus, subsidies, speeches. But each intervention solves less and costs more. The economy, once dynamic, becomes reactive, fragile, incapable of adapting without crisis. Then comes the event, not always dramatic, but definitive. A default, a failed auction, a diplomatic rupture, a military miscalculation, a signal that the center cannot hold. The reaction is swift. Markets panic, currencies plunge, institutions freeze. In this moment, collapse ceases to be theoretical. It becomes visible. Credit dries up, supply chains fracture, payments fail. What was once routine becomes uncertain. The empire, long sustained by momentum, begins to decelerate rapidly. Like a wheel losing balance, it spins harder, then shudders. Politically, the crisis deepens the divide. Leaders blame each other. Institutions deflect. Citizens choose sides or opt out entirely. The idea of unity becomes quaint. Policy becomes theater. Governance becomes damage control. And outside its borders, the world moves on. New centers of power assert themselves, not with confrontation, but with competence. Their systems, unburdened by imperial weight, appear stable by comparison. Trade resumes, just not through the empire. Innovation continues, just not within it. This is the sixth stage, the loss of global trust, the unraveling of privilege, the quiet exile from influence, not through conquest, but through obsolescence. The empire does not end here, but it stops being what it was. It no longer shapes the world. It reacts to it. It no longer commands. It negotiates. It no longer defines the future. It tries, desperately, to preserve the past. And the world, once organized around it, begins to forget. Collapse does not announce itself. It arrives disguised as continuity, until it doesn't. One morning, the system still functions. The next, it stutters. Institutions that felt eternal begin to flicker. The currency, long trusted, weakens beyond repair. What once held the empire together unravels, not through invasion or rebellion, but through exhaustion. The final stage unfolds with eerie speed. The tipping point passed. Events accelerate. Markets dive. Debts are called. The government scrambles for solutions, but the levers no longer respond. What worked for decades fails overnight. Liquidity vanishes. Faith disappears. The empire's tools, its currency, its diplomacy, its might, lose their effect. Abroad, allies break rank. New blocs emerge. Old rivals settle into the vacuum. The empire's demands are met with silence, or worse, with terms. Its reputation, once a shield, becomes a shadow. Deals are renegotiated. Bases closed. Agreements expire. At home, disarray becomes daily life. Services falter. Salaries go unpaid. Protests fill streets once orderly. Supply chains crack, then snap. Imports vanish. Rationing begins. The ordinary becomes precarious. Leadership splinters. Some call for reform, others for retreat. Extremes gain ground. The center, already hollowed out, collapses under pressure. Trust, the final currency of governance, is depleted. The collapse is not just economic. It is psychological. The story the empire told about itself, its mission, its virtue, its destiny, no longer persuades. Identity, once forged in shared pride, dissolves into confusion. What does it mean to be from a place that no longer commands respect? That no longer leads? Citizens look for new anchors, local, ideological, tribal. Some look backward, longing for what was. Others look outward, searching for where stability has migrated. But no one looks to the center anymore. It has become an echo. The military, stretched thin, begins to withdraw, not by policy, but by necessity. Ships return to port without orders. Units disband from lack of funding. Global presence recedes. Defense becomes defense again, not projection. The government begins to shrink, not by design, but by collapse. Departments go unfunded. Programs disappear. What remains is emergency rule, patchwork authority. The system survives on inertia, not legitimacy. The world no longer waits. New currencies rise. New platforms dominate. New voices lead. The vacuum fills quickly. The era of empire fades into reference. For those who remember, the fall feels surreal. A superpower undone not by a single act, but by 1,000 decisions, all made with certainty. The pace is jarring, the disbelief paralyzing, but the collapse was not sudden. Only its recognition was. Within a generation, the empire becomes a cautionary tale. Its artifacts remain, buildings, books, monuments. But its power does not. Students study its rise, its dominance, its hubris. They point to charts, speeches, policies. But the spirit is gone. The myth dissolved. And in its place, a new world forms. Not necessarily better, not more just. Only different, less centered, more fragmented. The patterns begin again, elsewhere. The empire has become history. Its name still spoken, but only in past tense. Its influence reduced to memory. And the lesson it leaves behind, one it never learned itself, is simple. Power is not permanent. Trust is not eternal. And no system, no matter how vast, can outrun the weight of its own design. In the silence that follows collapse, there is no triumph, no mourning, only the echo of what once was. The streets grow quieter. The symbols remain, but their meaning fades. Flags still fly, but without conviction. Titles persist, but they no longer command. What was once a superstructure of influence now drifts in the quiet light of memory. Time softens the sharp edges, the panic recedes. In its place comes something slower, reflection. A looking back, not just at what was lost, but at how it was lost. The questions shift from who to why, from fault to pattern. It becomes clear then that collapse was never a single moment. It was a sequence, a rhythm, each step following the last, predictable in hindsight, invisible in real time. Expansion became overreach. Prosperity became dependence. Power became pretense. And no one, not rulers, not citizens, was willing to step away from the edge. What was exceptional in the end was not the empire. It was the blindness to repetition, the refusal to see in the mirror of history the faces of others who had fallen the same way. Spain, Britain, the Soviet Union, each believed their moment was different. Each thought they were immune to gravity. Each mistook scale for strength, and each, in time, became a lesson. Now that lesson is written again, in the ruins of influence, in the fragments of trust, in the stories told by those who remain. Children grow up among relics. They hear of a time when their nation shaped the world, but the story they inherit is quieter, more cautious, less about greatness, more about consequence. In scattered corners, something begins to stir. Not revival, not yet, but the earliest stages of adaptation. Small communities rebuild. Local systems replace central ones. Trade returns, modest, reciprocal. Currency becomes simpler, anchored again to value. Trust, once national, becomes personal. Authority shifts closer to the ground. The world, too, moves forward. No longer orbiting a single power, it rebalances, imperfectly, unevenly. Some regions rise, others stall. But the cycle, always the cycle, prepares to begin again. Some will look for hope in this moment. Others will grieve. But the truth sits somewhere deeper. The story of empires is not about hope or despair. It is about rhythm. The rise, the reach, the fall, the quiet. And the rhythm does not end. It only pauses. There is a law beneath history, not written by men, but revealed through time. What cannot be sustained will not be sustained. No illusion, no matter how noble, how powerful, how widely believed, can defy structure forever. And so the empire ends, not with a cataclysm, but with a settling of dust, not with defeat, but with the return of balance. In its place, a space is left, for something new, for someone else, for another beginning. The light shifts, the ground steadies, and the cycle waits. Not to repeat, but to be remembered,